Awesome.
I love the logo, man. Star Wars Resistance.
The
It's
resist,
perfect. It is
and if I turn off my camera, it gets even better. Just
that is excellent, my friend.
yeah, I am believing in the resistance, and somebody asked me about it the other day, and I said, well, it started out as a political thing, and then but I realized like in the War on Art, and I'll think of the author in a moment. His book, The War on Art, he talks about resistance. Like if you're trying to create something, whether it's a painting or a writing, like I like to do it, and or a sculpture or something. He says if you're feeling resistance, that's what you need to push into. If it's easy, you already know how to do it. It's not going to engage your mind or your soul. You want to push into that stuff that's providing you some resistance. And then I saw that again, but it was talking about exercise, right? So it's like you can run all you want, but till you get some resistance, right? Those muscles aren't going to get. And like okay, not that necessarily hypertrophy is what I'm looking for in every aspect of my life, but yeah, muscular resistance, that emotional resistance, mental resistance, and these days political resistance.
Yes. Yeah, and that is certainly on my mind. Allen Crowley, you're a long-term OmniFuturist. You're a great author in both of our books. I won't point at them because I've got a smart camera that will change focus on both of the
All
books
right.
behind me. You've been managing editor for both of those and written for both of those. I'm so glad that you were able to come in today to talk a little bit about you and your chapter. Start by telling us a little bit about yourself, my friend, your history and your interests.
Well, I figured this question was coming, but I wanted to tell you, if I grew up, I'll start out this way. I grew up living in a castle, listening to the lions roar at dusk, and feeling the cool, hot air, come up the gully across the tops of the trees as I looked out into the sunset from the porch of the second story, porch is what we called it, battlement of the castle. But all of that is to say, I lived and grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, near the zoo. So in a large stone house that was quarried from um, mineral wells, which is maybe 75 miles away. And so when it was built in the late 30s, early 40s, that house it was well, I guess it was during the 30s because during the Depression, the guy that wanted to build the house was a railroad entrepreneur. And so he wanted to keep his trains running and the quarry running. So he kind of did it all on spec. Like, I will, I'm going to fund this big project, which is to build this big stone house and on an
When
acre
you
of land.
started, I was sure that you were exaggerating or, some sort of parable or some story that you had a point to it. No, you're saying this literally
That
was.
yes, literally. I grew up in a 4-story stone house with very special stone that was quarried in mineral wells, which looks like well, what it is. It's fossilized weeds, aquatic leaves that have just folded down. So if you look closely, you go, oh, that looks like a bunch of leaves that have all folded over and been crushed by dirt. Yeah, thousands of years ago. So maybe more. Anyway, yeah, it was really, and my parents sold that house eventually and bought the one I'm in now, actually, which you can't see, but um, they and I'm still in Fort Worth, but I'm now on the other side of Texas Christian University, uh, both physically and figuratively. I graduated from there in '86, so uh, and I'll drop this for a moment so you can see this house behind me. Uh, what I'm sitting on now was also a second story porch at one time, like I used to listen to the Lions on. Um, However, it's been wrapped in these legacy jalousie windows, and uh, you can see the brick up there above the whole house is made out of that. Every exterior wall is made out, well, not every, because like this exterior wall was added on top of the balcony, but the primary walls of the house, which has been expanded a little, all concrete cinder block. which is a fantastic building material. And uh, I, yeah, just so is stone. And I mention all that because I went back and I listened to Jacob and Ben and they made they because I wanted to get ahead of you on the questions, but but anyway, no, I thought it was interesting because they both talked about things that last, right? Types of energy systems in Jacob's case, and Ben was talking about financial systems and business systems and just the physical architecture of the world we live in. And that stone house I lived in, amazing. This cinder block house I'm living in, it's amazing. Um, and like when I visited Europe, when I say visited Europe, when I was stationed there as a soldier, um, there's houses there that are hundreds of years old. And one of the French naval officers I've made connection with let us stay in his house for a week because our occasion to visit, he was actually going to be out of town. So we had like a day and a half together. They left town and we left and threw the key back in the mail slot after. And I think they actually came back the next day, but I had to be back at U.S. European Command the next day, so I wasn't going to dally around. But those types of permanence, I think they're a testament to people. Yeah, yeah. Where am I from? You ask, tell me a little about yourself. But these are the kinds of things I think about, like these permanent testaments of architecture, and and how in America, for example, we are the new world. We do things a new way, right? We're not run by a king, or we fought a revolution to get rid of the king, right? We wanted a government by the people, and of course, it wasn't tagged that until fourscore and 20 years later, or whatever, fourscore and I don't know, a bunch of years later. But by for and of the people, we wanted some human enlightenment and human reason to drive the changes. Um, and we created the technology to to do what we do, which is, you know what, old idea, get rid of that building. It used to be, a saying when I studied urban development in college back at TCU down the street. Um, so they've got new, old ideas get new buildings, new ideas get old buildings. That kind of hermit crab thing. Whereas as your factory gets bigger, you don't necessarily have to buy a bigger factory. You look around for somebody who else is ready to move up to a larger scale, and you go occupy that next space. But now it's almost we're almost to the point like the Star Trek replicator in everybody's ideal post work world, Um, but instead of getting a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, you get a house, where it's like, or you go, you know what? We don't need a business. We don't need an office building here. We need a factory. Then it just the next day it's gone. I'm looking across the street at what was one of two beautiful houses that a singular architect had put together. They're both very similar floor pattern, but each with their own little unique differences. Now one of them's an empty field, and the other one is still a wonderful house. So anyway,
You and I are both roughly the same age. And so when we were growing up and we wanted to buy something, we'd go into, at least in my case, to the little town square. And each little shop had a few things. Some of them had been there for 15 years or whatever, a little dusty or whatever, and you get what you wanted. Hard to do an Amazon mega complex in one of those little bitty things.
right, you're
I
not going to put a
remember when they
gigafactory
started
in there.
doing the big box places, right? The big box replaced
Mhm.
all the little shops, and now all the big box, like a Sears or a Kmart or whatever, replaced by a colossal Amazon. You're right. We just keep bulldozing what was good 10 years ago and starting from scratch.
And there's merit to that, but it was really, I mean, touring and living in Europe and in Germany and France, and the level of permanence that's there just sort of blew my mind. Even though I lived in a 50-year-old house, and this house that I'm in now was built in 1938. So it's getting close to the 100-year mark. Yeah, it's and I think with I know like Ben mentioned, nanotechnology and cognitive technology and the kind of Neuralink is Musk's term for it. I like the cognotech term that comes out of the London Futurist there. But that cognotech where you can like directly from your mind or through radio wave, et cetera. I mean, it's a real thing. You, you are programming the manufacturing functions of a bunch of nanobots that can come in and I was impressed at how precise the big giant uh, machine looked like a backhoe, but it was so much bigger. It came in and it just crushed the house and scooped it and scraped it and did because it had just had the kind of a bucket scoop, but it would use it to smash and to scoop. So just leveled that place and created a little pile of broken lumber and independent bricks. And then a bulldozer that was twice the size of a riding mower, not a big giant bulldozer, but a little one that could get into this smaller yard from when they were plotting houses back in the 30s and 40s. Scooped all that stuff into the back of a truck. I pushed it and they scooped it into the back of a truck, and all of it was gone in a day.
Right, and which would have been a month-long project by dozens of low-paid, struggling folks in the past. You're
Mhm.
right. Oh, you're right. Hey,
Yeah,
why don't you go on and tell us a little bit about the chapter that you wrote?
yeah, that's why I've kind of delayed talking about that because as the editor, I started on one chapter and I started on another, and then I read somebody else's paper that came in. I'm like, oh, I want to get that idea in there. And at some point I was like, okay, I don't have a chapter. What I have is a whole bunch of paragraphs of different ideas. And and I just pushed all that to the side and I said, I'm gonna use AI and ask it to uh, write, for me. So with a lot of coaching, and I use two different AIs, and of course Grammarly to check it all at the end. But I gave it these ideas of victory and wisdom. Nike and Sophia having a conversation. So it's done like a Socratic dialogue. So it was interesting because uh, it wasn't like I just said, "Oh, give me a Socratic dialogue and hit go" or whatever. I mean, first I had to hit the books and go, what makes it a proper Socratic dialogue, right? It's not just that there's questions and answers. Um, and then I had to coach the AI into doing it. Of course, as our systems get better, hopefully our own heads will get better. And we can just say, give me a Socratic, conversation about this topic. Here's the pro and con side. And it'll
Yeah.
give it to us.
Let me just make an observation is that one of the first people in our group to immediately leap onto the power of using the machine intelligence for writing was Art Ramon. And
Mhm.
at the time, this is last year's book, I was strictly in the zone where I was going to write every word, and even for this year's book. But
Yeah.
for next year's, I'm clearly have drifted over, and the power of this sort of examination, the leverage that you get for bringing in a lot of words in seconds
Hmm.
that, that follow what you want to do and what your point is very powerful. And so I've been converted. I was very easily into the mode where I could generate art with the machine intelligence because I don't really have a whole lot of talent or patience. But for the writing, I wanted to do it myself. I'm changing my mind. I have the ideas that I want to get across, the perspective or the opinion, and then I ask for more writing and more evidence from the AI. So I
It's a
I'm going
yes.
with you.
Those are, I mean, it's a tool like any other. And I don't think that, I mean, I don't consider AI doing the writing for me. I mean, not really, because I will write something and I can get ideas on paper. And as a science fiction writer, I'm in a local writers group, and and I'll read my stuff and they go, oh, you're trying to pack too many different ideas in there. And to me, that's like, okay, I'm marching toward the sound of the guns, but as I read science fiction, especially older science fiction, what science fiction writers that are talking about science and technology and not just a speculative story about the future, that they pick one thing to change. Like, what if cars ran on water? Boom. And then they deal with the story about that, or that invoke. And whenever I've read that, I'm like, yeah, that's cool. That's, people made this change and that change and society adapted, but that's never how things work. Right? It's not like, oh, what if radios were TVs? It's like, and in a science fiction kind of classic science fiction model story, it's like, well, you would just swap radios and TVs. But in reality, there's going to be a legacy system, right? There will still be, just like we still have post-it notes and messengers, et cetera, and notepads.
Let me go on to your comment about science fiction, and let's talk for a moment about a couple of things. One of which is that excellent logo behind you, and the second is your shirt. And let me just say a little bit about that. Is lifelong Star Wars fan. I saw the original movie in the theater because, of course, we didn't have the interwebs when you and I were kids, right? We went and saw it. So I love the Star Wars. And the second thing is I'm mortified at the 50% cut that some are proposing against NASA science budget. And so I'm a force for science as well, my friend. So why don't you tell us about the resistance and your shirt?
Sure, sure. Well, the Force for Science shirt is put out by a science organization that I I don't even know what it's called. It's AAAMS, I think. It's on the back in tiny letters, and I don't know what they do, but for whatever reason, they gave me a T-shirt, and which I thought was really cool. I'm a force for science, so like that's the message. Then I realized like it's not their acronym. What's the IFFS? It's like no, it's not. It's so anyway. But I do think we all need to be a force for science, right? Because it doesn't have to take away from what we do. I mean, and I'll go back to this using AI to write. There's key things that I need to know when I tell it, write this from a conservative perspective, use these type of words for conservative language. Have the other person write from, or, speaking from a libertarian perspective, right? And use these type of words. And then here's a third person, they're going to be a progressive and they're going to use this, list type of words. And then I can get it to write the same story, my story that I've already written, right? I can get it to rewrite it three different ways in less than 30 minutes, right? And then I can read and look at each one and say, okay, that sounds like the computer said that. And then I convert it to real dialogue, something that a person would say. And I think that anyway, I think those tools are really helpful, and they are tools. So, Force for Science and the Resistance. No, the beauty of doing Zoom interviews is having your computer in front of you to research. The War on Art is a book by Stephen Pressfield. So I thought I would remember that name during this interview, but yeah, I mentioned it once already. That book is a great book and talks about emotionally going toward that resistance. So when these people say, "Oh, you got too many ideas in there," I like this idea. I consider that the resistance right there, because that's not how reality. Not that it has to be real, right? Don't let reality stand in the way of a good story, but it's got to be understandable that when somebody creates a bionic arm on the one side, then somebody is going to create a biologic arm on the other, right? So you can use, or they're going to create a nanotechnology version, or they're going to create a digital version that's an arm somewhere else, like out in outer space that you can use, right? Without, sitting comfortably on your porch looking out at the the world. And so I think all those ideas about it's going to be this way or that way, it's sort of silly. I mean, it's like the reason that there's only data in Star Trek. It's like, well, it's because it's hard to make robot characters or a lot of robots for your TV show, right? So we'll write in a little backstory. There was a robot revolution and we got rid of all that. Um, but that's not really how stuff works, right? I mean, there might be a robot revolution, but just like like the first cars were electric. It's not like that's a new thing, electric cars. It's just that cars that run on benzene get a lot are much more mobile and versatile, and it's easier to transport the fuel and all that. So, and yeah, I'll let Jacob Bilberg talk about that. He's got that down. Yeah, I mean, when we're not going to get nuclear cars either, because you've got to have a certain scale to get a reaction, so to speak, unless it's just going to be a decaying uranium heater, right? Which might work for you. It works for robots on Mars, but but I think we're never going to be a one solution anything really, society or government and I think that a lot of people look for that. What's the pill I can take for this? As opposed to, oh, well, can I just exercise? Or, oh, can I just, well, no, it's diet, exercise, and it's also rest. You can't just exercise all the time. You just pass out or whatever. So all those combinations have to come together to make something work really well, to be integrated, be well-rounded, to be sustainable in that sense, right? And also to be able to be resilient so that if the system takes some damage, it can then heal itself and move on.
Very good. Let's go on a little bit to the economic singularity, if you don't mind, because that is kind of one of the things that we focus on in our Future Visions books. And, one of the things that I want to hear you talk about is, for example, do you think that the economic singularity is likely to occur in the next 10 years? And if not, when, if ever?
Well, if you had read my article in the first book, no, I'm teasing. I'm teasing. um, no, I have an opinion of. I think the singularity is a real thing, and it's a physics term, and you discuss that in your latest chapter of the new book very well. No point in making the spoiler out of that. But this idea of just the word itself, singularity, and it conjures up the idea of a singular event, and it's important to note that a singularity is really a horizon, and that's in a mathematical sense, right? And even if when people talk about, oh, if you go into a black hole, the big problem you face is spaghettification, because the top, your head is responsive to gravity over here. Your feet are responsive to this greater gravity over there, and you're being stretched out like a piece of spaghetti. Well, if you said, does that sound like a singularity to you? Most people would say, no, that sounds like you're being stretched as a piece of spaghetti for eternity. It's like, and so once you say, oh, for eternity, that's what makes it a singularity, right? That, and you can't predict what happens after, right? Yeah, it's like when a parabolic curve goes vertical, all the answers after that are on the same x-axis. So I say all that to move on with what I think about the singularity and when it will come, is that it's not going to be, as I say in the first edition, Future Visions, it's not going to be on a Tuesday. And I tried to make a cute, because I'm a writer, I want to make a little cute acronym of the upcoming economic singularity day, right? The upcoming, and so it's not written in stone that it's going to happen, highly likely, most probable course of human events, probably. It's not guaranteed, but even if it does happen, it's not going to happen, like I say, on a Tuesday. that you're going to wake up, you're going to go to bed Monday night, and it's the ordinary world, and you literally wake up in a new world the next day, right? It's where nothing works the same. But if you took a caveman and brought him to New York City, that's what they would think, right? So but because they've missed out on all the intervening years, and they don't have historians to go, oh yeah, 428 when Claudius said, I guess we're done here. That's when the Roman Empire ended. It's like, no, it's probably like 100-year period, right, for the final collapse of the Roman Empire. And I think that's true. A great example, the Korean War, North and South Korea, primarily the US fighting on one side, but they declared peace, so to speak, and a ceasefire. But both sides knew that when the firing ceased, whatever those positions are were going to be their bargaining chips. So while there had been a confrontational stalemate for weeks, right? When they said, oh, we're going to have a ceasefire that's going to start in a week, all of a sudden both sides launched into full combat mode, right? And just to get a few more yards, just to get the next hill, just to get, around the bend or the other side of the river. And yeah, silly as that sounds, and the waste of lives and all that sort of stuff. When historians look back, they're not going to say, oh, what they'll most likely say, based on what other historians have said, is like, oh, the Korean War ended here when they did this ceasefire. Not that it went on for weeks and, over maybe 3 days here and 5 days there and a full 7 on the other end. So I think there's going to be a lot of that going on with the singularity, right? There are lots of factors, and I've been saying this since the 80s, because man, I got my Commodore 64 with a tape deck and cassette tape, data recording, and man, I was browsing bulletin boards, and I told people, I said, one of these days, your phone number is just going to be like your name, which they all standing on the steps of TCU over there in 1986. They're like, nah, man, nobody's going to go, nobody's name is going to be like 817-924, whatever. And I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we'll be using numbers and characters. And for your number, you'll just say Allen Crowley, Mike DeVerde, number 3. If they're, for the Smiths, you might be John Smith, number 755, right? And that is exactly what we do now, is we use our emails that way, and our emails work with the text and et cetera. So I talk to my phone, I say, call Mike. It's like, it does its thing, right? I don't know where I was going with that. Anyway, all of that to say that this idea that it's all going to happen in a day or overnight is something that now your question does. So when will it happen? Maybe it's going to be in a decade, within the decade, but it'll be in 20 years when we say 10 years ago, that's when the singularity happened.
And that's fair. That is a very good answer. And I was going to tease you about dancing around the question. I'm going to point out a couple of things. One is, by using the term economic singularity, we're having enough trouble getting people to face the possibility that all the jobs are going to go away. Who knows when? That's not what we're talking about. Is you need some way of getting across there's a massive transformation about to occur. And so if I had to say to somebody today, Great Depression, they know what we're talking about. And of course, that was a 10-year period of misery, and it wasn't over just because we went to war with Germany, right? It was
right.
War
that was
II.
That was the moment.
And the transition to economic prosperity occurred a lot longer, but then really took off like a rocket ship. So part of it was to get something that could concisely get across the idea. And then I'm going to point out that you used parabolic graph as an example and say to you that this may occur so rapidly that your head spins. I think we're already seeing some of that with the emergence of some of the generative machine intelligence, perhaps agentic coming on. This
Yes.
is happening extremely rapidly. But anyway, let's go on to like, what would you, if you just gave the good example of, let's say that in 10 years it occurs in seriousness, but it'll take us 20 years uh, until we're at
Yeah,
the
an
point at
additional,
which we said it occurred. So the question for you then is, how would you define the onset? Say you're 20 years from now, you're looking back as a historian. What would you look as the defining feature of an economic singularity?
I mean, I'm sure viewers, listeners are probably familiar with Callum Chase's work, the economic singularity, which really prompted, I think, probably everybody who's started on this project and who's with it now, um, uh, gave them the motivation to get started on this. Thank you, Callum. But in any case, I think that he lays out a good definition of this idea of the point at which you can't tell what's going to happen next. That singularity horizon is when we have is that transition from where you have a whole lot of people losing their jobs to automation or cognitive automation or whatever you want to call it, to some sort of offloaded to a machine of some kind. That employment level is coming down, and in some degrees, prosperity is going up because those, um, for one, those people that are out of a job, they're not just a, a marble that you move from one category to another. They can climb themselves back into some other job, or they can be doing other things. Like my wife and I, we're in the iron and steel business. She irons and I steel. I mean, I don't know that crime will be rampant, but that's a possibility. And I don't know that just maybe it'll just be an unemployment malaise, like I got a job to go to, but I got lots of cheap booze, or whatever. So, which those are equally disastrous situations. Some types of moral malaise. But I think there's some point there where it kind of begins, right? That's where this sort of spectrum of going onto this road of things not working right. And then I think at some point we hit a position where, okay, automation has made everything as cheap as possible, but now jobs are so few, it's kind of restricted to the people that know how to manage artificial intelligence systems and who the nanobot controller guy, and he's got a job to do, and the RNA gene sequencing, technicians got something to do.
Or the guy who's flying all the drones for the inevitable wars that are going to occur. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Oceania and Eurasia. I mean, you got to have drone pilots for that, right? But I think we'll transition through all that, and it's somewhere at the sort of the bottom of that where you've got things that can be made incredibly inexpensively. There's the potential for productivity in the market, but the opportunities are not there for it. So whether that takes reschooling or retooling or different value system, right? What if handmade things became, that's the new scarcity, right? Is a handmade, anybody can get a machine made, BMW. I want one of the handmade ones, whatever, right? So I think that point right there, and I don't know exactly where that horizon is, and I think that all of the terms that we use are nebulous enough that we'd have to make sure we were all on the dictionary version to really to make these ideas more precise. Now you've gotten, and I know you've gone toward this, and I think you've made a great step forward. Spoiler, read his, it's first in the book for a reason. Um, the, the, and mine's at the end for a reason. That's modesty, but, the other point is that just like it's not a singular technological development that moves us forward, right? It's this combination, this back and forth, kind of Hegel's dialectic between the steam engine run by oil and the steam engine run by the sun or a decaying rock. It's not just one or the other. It's both, and it's many. And I think that if we look around the planet and take a snapshot at any time in the last 4,000 years, what we'll notice is that some places look more advanced than others. And this changes over time too, right? I mean, the Aztecs, by far more advanced in irrigation and whatever than the Europeans or whatever, were viewed as like savages and barbarians, right? Whereas the Romans probably would have looked at them and said, oh, they have an aqueduct system like us, but instead of bringing it into cities and fountains, they use it to irrigate the whole countryside. Angkor Wat was probably the same way. Right? It's a whole nation that's been put under an a monsoon controlling system technology, right? It's just waterways. And oh, how do people figure that out? Well, you dig a ditch and let water flow through it. I mean, it's just, no aliens required.
Your perspective there, kind of worldwide and over many centuries, then leads right into the next question, which is, how do you think that humanity should deal with the economic singularity?
So for the same reasons that we have a patchwork of technologies around the planet now, and I think that we won't have a singularity. It might happen Tuesday in the US because we're highly dependent on technology, but a more agricultural country might be like, singularity, schmingularity, whatever, it doesn't affect them because they're still in kind of a agricultural mode, and this can happen at any point, I guess. The solar powered society, becomes a bust if there's a meteor crash that clouds the skies. The folks that are still using antiquated oil, well, they got plenty of power.
Well, Venezuela and Ethiopia are probably not going to have it at the same moment we do. Okay, so do you
Yeah,
think
fair
that
enough.
we'll
But yeah,
ever achieve superabundance? I think I
well,
know
I
your
think,
answer.
I mean, yeah, what was that question in between there though? One was about the timing of the singularity, and the next one was about
Well, how do you think that humanity should deal
should
with the
deal, should deal
economic
with.
singularity?
Yeah, and I
How
really, and I
should
wanted to
we?
come back to that and I just want
Go
to come
ahead.
back to because should implies can. Okay, so if we're talking about the perspective of humanity, let's identify that we're going to have multiple singularities popping up around the globe at multiple or sweeping the globe or however it moves across the globe um, over at multiple times, right? It's sort of like the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So we'll have those. Yeah, thank you to William Gibson there. Anyway, those things I'll do this way. Those things that we're putting together as a solution here, by the time that technological solution is needed somewhere else, there might be a better technological solution. So they might actually be finding a different solution to the singularity than we use here. And I think that those multiple forces, multiple factors, and multiple locations of intensity of singularity, right, are the exact kind of thing I'm talking about. That don't lead to a clear-cut line. So how do we handle it? Can we? I mean, I think it'll have to be locally, it'll have to be regionally, and it will also have to be interconnectedly, because I think there'll need to be a lot of sharing of best practices. Yeah, so that's how we should
I think
regionally,
you and I
locally, and sharing.
are relatively similar in how we approach this, and I have a hope. This is just a hope and a dream, but and there is a version of realism here. What I think is likely to happen is the economic singularity might be, and let me just roughly a decade of abysmal economic conditions throughout the world, different levels of abysmal, depending on where you are in which country in the world. But my hope is that we go through this decade of pain, but at the end of that era, I'm hopeful that some form of artificial superintelligence concocts a plan of how to harness all of those mechatronic devices, the artificial intelligence, the robots, and industrial capacity to distribute a superabundance throughout the world and not have it all just end up in Muskrat's $1 trillion pocket, or
Right.
Jeff Bozo the clown we end up with 2 trillionaires and the rest of us are penniless eating tortillas and beans. Okay,
Yeah, I mean,
I
at some
and
point you got
I
to be able to buy those things, or they're not worth making. Yeah.
well, I think just to appease the crowd, if you go back, you were mentioning the Romans, right? The bread and
Right.
circus
Circuses, yes,
of
sir.
just handing out beans and tortillas. And, my first wife was from Mexico. One of the things she talked about was I always wondered why there wasn't a revolution in Mexico because the wealth inequality was very bad, single political party. And what I found out over time was Mexico was doing a pretty good job of making sure people literally had tortillas and beans so that they survived and they
Yep.
weren't starving, their kids weren't starving, and there wasn't a revolution. You just kind of placate people with the littlest amount. So let's say that there's just a lot of football and baseball games on TV all the time. So there's sports, there's some
Right now, the clown show in DC right now is better than any other event. It is WWE and reality TV all rolled into one, and or whatever the wrestlers call
so
themselves.
for
Anyway,
me, the
but
question
but the
of
thing is, they're
how
cutting the bread line.
So for me, the question about how to deal with economic singularity actually was linked to superabundance. That question, how I think many of us in this are looking for a way towards superabundance. I think we're starting to see that the beginnings of, you've seen in some of my episodes on robots in space where I'm sometimes focusing on the humanoid bots and some of the dexterity and the manipulation and the decision making. You see the ingredients for perhaps having a huge, cheap workforce to provide for everybody, not just the rich. That's
Right.
kind of where I was going with that but the transition, I'm going to use a probably not a very good example, but the switch from mercantilism to capitalism took a long time 500 years ago, whenever it
Yeah.
occurred, right? But at the end of it, we were all much better off. Okay, much better developments. And maybe there's a transition period where we then harness artificial superintelligence would be my fever dream to achieve superabundance so that there's nobody starving or dying for lack of vaccines. But,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
let me,
And, oh, okay. So, and that goes back to this other sort of thing about it's hard to find a one-all solution when, and here we're talking about sort of willful ignorance of folks that are not interested in understanding science and not interested in using reality to make reality better. Um, so I mean, I, I it's funny. My wife and I kind of tease each other that I'm the guy talking about the blue sky, and I tease her about being the black abyss, right? But between the two of us, right, with the wisdom of the crowd, there we can get to a pretty good ground level base truth, right? Or and uh, we tease each other about that. So anyway, uh, but I think that's the case. I really want to be optimistic, but I've been married for 35 years now. She's taught me a thing or two, and I'm like, probably ain't going to go that way. And yet I also know, as horrible as I can conceive it, right, probably not going to go that way either. right? And that we will be somewhere in the middle of that cone of probability, right? Now, I think ultimately, when we get to the rock bottom of singularity, so to speak, when it just gets bad enough, at least here in the US, let's say, right? Because that might come later for Europe and even later for more agrarian areas. Um, if we don't latch on to those things that are critical for the success of civilization, energy, and really it's just energy, right? Like it's, you can say energy and food production and yada yada, but how are you producing your food? Are you going out there and laboring in the field on your own every day? Is that the energy you're using? Or are you using a are you using a cow? Because that's a big step up, right? Or are you using a diesel tractor? Or does your diesel tractor go out there and, do it itself, right? Or does, automated, or is it an electric tractor that's fueled off of, solar or nuclear generator, right?
Or
So,
uses lasers to shoot down the weeds, okay, which is another current. No, really, I mean,
no, right. That's
and
very
this,
precision cutting, right? And we
yeah,
can
and
do
you're
that
right about
on
this.
a
And
mass scale. Yeah,
this is what's magic about Jacob and his focus on energy and some of the new modular nuclear. But going back to your black and white pessimism, optimism,
sure.
I tend to frame it for simplicity in the discussion of cyberpunk versus solar punk. Okay.
Yeah,
And
and
it,
it
wait,
works. I'm not a
wait,
fan of it. But
yeah,
anyway,
I
go
know
ahead.
you aren't. But let me just say that leads to the next question is because of, let's say, a version where artificial superintelligence might produce super abundance, or it might just funnel incredible wealth to two bozos. Okay. So are you concerned at all about the arrival of artificial superintelligence?
Well, I say no in general, right? Because I think there may be a dozen good ones and a dozen bad ones, and ultimately we'll get a couple of mediocre ones that'll work. I think, and, and that is also what allays my concerns about Bezos and whoever it turns out to be, Gates, and a handful of the 5 or 6 wealthiest people here, and the one from maybe every other country in the world. That whatever, that 1%. Those folks, so what if they own everything? If that abundance is available to all, even if it's not at the same level of abundance, right? Now, it's one thing if, I mean, even the French peasant in the field, who was mucking up was like, yeah, but I live in the nation that's, with the greatest king in the world, it's like, and you know, 2 or 3 Louis later, they're like, let's get the hell out of here. We need to cut some heads off. Um, but so I think, and that's sort of the risk that governments take and oligarchies take, is that they are fewer in number and et cetera. But I mean, if you can go over to your food replicator and hit the button and get you a ham and cheese on rye with, hot milk or whatever, right? I mean, you're really going to be worried about, oh yeah, but I don't actually own the house. Probably not, right? I mean, maybe. I mean, look at us now. We have hot and cold running water, and we have roofs over our head. I mean, most people. I'm not saying it's, but in this nation, while we have an obscenely high number of unhoused and poorly housed folks, um, for the amount of wealth here, certainly, but the majority of our folks are pretty good access to food and clothing and housing, um, with their paycheck, and yet there's plenty to complain about. So I don't think humanity will run out of things to complain about. No, I think the advent of super intelligence, it can do something that human governance has real trouble doing. And that is to be unbiased. Now, their bias is built into the system. You've probably seen the hand dryer that wouldn't dry black people's hands because it was designed by light reflected up from the, from a white hand. Anyway, so I mean, you can build bias into the systems, but usually that's done, but it's probably not nearly as biased as a judge in the South Dallas court, or as biased as maybe a police officer in Grapevine, Texas, or whatever. So I think that's something that if you, although I would prefer to build the system first and let the other just fall away, that probably a lot of government activity, processing checks, collecting revenue, making all that banking, that could all be done digitally. And a lot of functions could have portal access that was really well done and made it easy to communicate to our elected and non-elected representatives, right?
The reason that I founded the OmniFuturist is that I saw no serious efforts to actually plan for this sort of a future where perhaps there's a large uprooting of people, and how would we reconstruct our government and our economy for this new reality. And so this sort of topic of, and my fear is, of course, that we're going to kind of stumble and bumble our way into the future instead of, you just described, I would prefer to plan a system out in advance for this. None of that is occurring.
Right.
So that's kind of the focus of these books, is to try to get people thinking about what we ought to be doing for planning this. So
Yeah.
was
And
very,
that goes back to the first thing is a vision, right? I mean, and that's like when I talked about writing the story. I wrote it once, so but I had my vision, and then I knew I wanted my protagonist to speak differently, because you don't want to hear just two versions of me talking to myself, right? And so I got the conservative and the politically conservative, politically liberal, and politically progressive people.
You guys here to make the address, Kurt?
Okay, all right, I'll be down in a minute. Thanks. I could really dial that in using the computer and the technology to do that, right? But you've got to know what you want to be able. I mean, if you don't know what you want, a computer's going to give it to you just as quickly as it'll give you what you do want, right? So again, that requires, I think, it's a little bit different, fundamental kind of learning, much more like the classical liberal education, in the sense of liberal education. But it also requires skills. One needs to know how to do all a lot of the programming and stuff too. So, although I got computers for that.
Alan, you're a busy man, so we're going to wrap up with this last question, sir. What other topic is first and foremost in your mind? So let me give you some examples. You got space travel and colonization, or super longevity, or crypto, geopolitics, quantum mechanics, or quantum computers. What's your thing?
Well, let's just say yes. No, actually, I brought, okay, so here's The Case for Space by Robert Zubrin. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, maybe not. The Case for Space.
Shows up and then it flicks out.
Yeah.
So that works great.
So one of I like Robert Zubrin's work. He's one of the founders of the
Mars Society, right?
The Mars Society, formerly the L5 Society. They just moved a little farther out. The other one is Seasteading, and this is a great book. Seasteading: How Floating Nations Will Restore the Environment, Enrich the Poor, Cure the Sick, and Liberate Humanity from Politicians, by Joe Quirk. So seasteading, highly recommended. Another one of my favorite topics. And then Jose Cordero, but his book, The Death of Death. So living longer and longevity. And then the Transhumanist Reader, wonderful book, but similar to our own work in that it's a collection of authors, although they all tend to be pro-futurist, pro-technologist, so it's a very human machine mix kind of book. But and I know you want to wrap up, Mike, and I gotta go, but let me see if I can. This seasteading book by Joe Quirk talks about creating floating nations at sea. And I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm not sure I like the idea of carving up the United States into private fiefdoms, which own, and creating city states that are privately owned and privately operated that compete for people to live in them. Because I think that
What you're-
typically,
Yeah, what you're referring to, I'm going to put a more of a label on it. There's a group of dark MAGA neo-reactionaries who think that we should switch from the American Republic, a form of representative democracy, into regions ruled by CEO tech magnates as being more efficient. And that is an incredibly repulsive idea to me. It's embarrassing because I'm very much interested in science and technology. And I think that technocrats, and I mean real technocrats, not these pseudo idiots,
not you and
currently
me.
trying to sell neo-reactionaries, right? So yes, I agree with you on that. I want to also say, if I had a choice, you just talked about living on Mars versus seasteading. If I had to live in a tunnel for the rest of my life under Mars to be safe from radiation, versus some island in the Pacific that was artificially created, I might take the Tahiti solution. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah, especially when there's fish to catch and
Air to breathe.
yeah. I heard you discussing the what do they call that, golden rice that's got extra vitamin A, and there's the saltwater resistant rice and the high protein rice. Yeah.
Just saying.
So yeah, I end that on a warning note. We have voted for a patchwork of nation states.
Very strange future ahead. We are going to wrap now. Alan, fantastic. We're going to do this again because you and I have a lot to talk about. Allen Crowley, managing editor of the OmniFuturist, a great futurist, a great author, great editor. Appreciate your time and your interest.
I'm grateful to be on the team, Mike. Really, thank you.
We are having fun, aren't we?
Yeah, no, and thank you for. I know he's watching David Shapiro and Callum Chase. Got some serious ideas, and thank you for introducing me to those folks.
Yeah, we're going to have a good time with it. So thank you again, and we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
And
Omni Futurists.